we got to close the show, and I've got to say this, that I haven't wanted to say this, and I've tried to put it off. We got nothing else to talk about today but this, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get it over with. Vince Russo has defeated me, scorched me. I'm here to admit it. I'm a beaten man. Vince Russo is the winner of this thing. Because last week, everybody knows it made a lot of news. I came out and I made a challenge. Since he had talked about wanting to meet me face-to-face on his show or on my show or on a neutral show, face-to-face, man-to-man, I offered to meet him, place of his choosing, just not for public consumption. No fans, no tickets being sold, no profit being made off of it, no cops, no guns, no knives. What happens, happens. And a large cash amount that I would have with me for him to show up if he could take it away from me. And I said horrible things. That probably, I said every horrible thing about another human being and his family that I could think of to say. And imagine how much territory that takes in. And he responded. He responded to all of that as any true man would, defending his honor and the honor of his wife and his family with a blistering comedy routine. He showed me the error of my ways. He blistered me with one-liners straight out of the fucking Henny Youngman book. As a matter of fact, he showed me the difference in how to handle things, because the last time that a guy fucked with me that bad and said horrible things about me and fucked with my business and insulted my wife and said things about her on my answering machine, I took a baseball bat to two of that guy's stooges, and then I tried to run that guy over with my car in broad daylight on the busiest street in Knoxville. That story's been told many times. But Vince Russo showed me how I should respond to something like that. He responded with shtick. But not just any shtick. No, it was shtick for the ages. It was shtick that would have made any Borscht Belt comic working a senior citizen's home in the Catskills proud. Jackie Mason, Norm Crosby, they could not touch this fucking guy. And I am suitably chastened. Because I hope I remember everything that I want to say, because I don't have Vince Russo's massive writing talent, the ability to sit down for a couple of days with a dictionary and maybe watch some old B movies and write down some really good insults and then read them verbatim off a piece of paper. I've got to fight Vince Russo's encyclopedic vocabulary and his incredible wide-ranging knowledge of old comedy lines with I always thought misconstrued, by the way, was just a joke between me and Star Maker Bolin. I didn't know it's actually how you pronounce that word, but now I know, and I'm sorry I missed that day in class. But all I have to rely on here, folks, is my ability to actually cut a promo and speak extemporaneously off the top of my head from my heart, because I really mean this stuff, as opposed to what Vince does, which was sit down with a dictionary, maybe his stooge co-host of his show to help him, and really write down some boffo material that would have got him over in any comedy club in a bottom 50 market in the United States. But before I make this apology and admit this defeat, I do have to correct Vinny Roo on one thing. The one thing that he was slightly, and I know he deals with so many people and he gets so many threats and he has so many people that say things on his answer machine or on shows or to his face that he may have forgotten the specific details of this, so it's not his fault. He didn't mean to tell a blatant lie. He just did it accidentally. But he said that his 5-year-old son heard when I called up and left a message on his answer machine where I threatened the lives of his wife and his children. And I admit I did call him up and threaten his life. I've done that many times. But what happened was, back in the year 2000, it was the year after that he had left the WWF, the people that had, Vince McMahon, the guy that gave him, the biggest paying job he'd ever had and got him into wrestling on a mainstream basis. And he left him with no notice, with just a phone call, even though the TV taping was 50 miles from his house, and he could have come down and shake Vince's hand. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it because it was, Vince didn't want to steal the attention away from the TV taping that night. So he left under cover of darkness with a mere phone call with no notice. But about 9 months later, Kevin Kelly and Bruce Pritchard came down to OVW and visited me, checking out the developmental program, and I was taking them to the airport so they could fly back that night after the OVW taping. And they mentioned how that the previous Monday, they had been down in Atlanta for the first time in a long time. They'd done a Raw taping down there. And because Bruce Pritchard and Kevin Kelly were always really friendly with Vince Russo, that they'd been over at each other's houses and their wives talked, and they hadn't had the heat that I'd had with Vinny Roo. And they had called him while they were down in Atlanta and wanted to see if they might want to get together, just shoot shit about old times. And he ignored their call, didn't call them back. And they kind of, they felt, bad, disappointed about that, I guess. They thought they were friends. And I happened to mention, I said, I think my exact quote was, "You got that motherfucker's number?" So Bruce Pritchard handed me his phone and pressed the button so that I could call Vince Russo, because I had some things I wanted to say to him at the time, because when I had left and come down to Louisville, he was still working for the company. And even though I had told Jim Ross before I left, I said, when I head to Louisville, my last day here, I'm going to hospitalize Vince Russo. And JR had talked me out of it. He said, "No, it'll screw up the developmental program. Please don't do that." I said, "All right. JR, I respect and admire. I did him a favor." But I had never got a chance to tell Vince Russo what I thought of him. And now that he was working for another company, I didn't feel the professional need to be professional. So I got that phone in my hand, and Vince Russo answered the phone. And I said, "Vince." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Jim Cornette." I said, "Well, I said a lot of things. Like, I just want to tell you what a fucking piece of shit and prick you were. I always thought you were, and how you cut my nuts off and you stabbed other people in the back, and I fucking hate you and I want to kill you." Of course, he hung up on me. So I called back, and I got his voicemail, and I left that voicemail message where I talked about what all I'd like to do to him and at the time, and that if he had anything to say to me, I gave him my phone number, which I'm not going to give out here, but it was my legitimate phone number. And I handed Bruce's phone back. And I never heard from Vince at the time, and actually Bruce and Kevin never heard back from him either, but who did hear from him was Vince called the next day or day or two later, called the WWF Human Resources Department and reported that Bruce Pritchard and his cohort Kevin Kelly had put me up to some way to calling him and leaving him a nasty message and used their phone. And also that's when he mentioned, and of course, like I said, this was an innocent, he didn't mean to lie. It was an innocent mistake. He just told him he misunderstood me with somebody else, and he told the Human Resources Department at the WWF that I'd also threatened to kill his wife and his children, which was not true. And believe me, obviously, after all I've said, I would admit that too, but he wanted to get Bruce and Kevin fired, his friends, because, they loaned me that phone, so it was obviously their fault. And luckily, for Bruce and Kevin, because they had families to support and they had jobs, the Human Resources Department did not take that action, although Bruce did call me and said, "Please, don't ever call this guy anymore because it was terrible for us." So I didn't. But otherwise, everything else that he said, in the reply that he made to my challenge last week was true. He said I was a mark because I blew my knee coming off the scaffold because I didn't know how to take a bump. And that's true, because on the day that they taught scaffold bumps in the wrestling school that I didn't go to because they didn't have any then, I did play hooky that day. But I've watched some tapes of Vince's work in the ring, and now I do know how to take a bump, because where I made my mistake was after I blew my knee coming off that 25-foot scaffold, and I had that knee surgery. And I had all that blood drained off my knee, and I had everything cleaned up. I never got it fixed, actually. It's still to this day, I don't have an ACL in that knee because I couldn't take that much time off of work because the Midnight Express needed me. But I had the surgery and got it all cleaned out. I took 10 days off, and I came back on the road on crutches to fulfill my bookings to make sure that the fans weren't disappointed, and because the Midnight Express needed me. But now I know better. I know better because Vince Russo, after the first and only bump that he ever took in his life down in WCW, he was such a great worker that he claimed that he had a severe concussion, that he had brain damage, which actually may explain some things. And to make sure that he didn't, although a guy like Vince Russo with his upstanding principles, he wouldn't have sued the company, but to make sure for some reason WCW thought he was going to sue him. So to make sure that he didn't sue the company, WCW let him sit home for months and collect his check in the mailbox until he felt up to coming back to work. Now, that's the way that a man handles things in wrestling. And I got to tell you, I realized I don't want to fight Vince Russo anyway now, because I just got a chance. Somebody showed me his WCW promo picture, his publicity picture, where he's standing there and he's got this sleek black baseball bat in his hands, and he's dressed all in black leather, and he's got that beard stubble coming out because he hadn't shaved in 3 or 4 days. He just looked like that badass lead singer in Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and nobody wanted to mess with that guy. So I didn't realize, I just saw Vince in his off time. I didn't realize when he really, got shit together that he was such an intimidating figure. That's why I asked to fight him, because I didn't realize he was such a badass. And as far as fighting experience, I thought I was doing pretty good, but I guess I'm outgunned, there too, because, I've only had about 15 assault arrests for defending myself against pissed off fans that attacked me in arenas, and been in about a dozen lawsuits and a bunch of riots, and most of them that I started because the fans were so pissed off at me because I didn't know how to work. But Vince Russo, he even said in his book that he has never been in a fight in his life. And you know why I figured this out? I now know why, because people hear that Brooklyn accent and the word bro coming out of his mouth, and they just know right off the bat he's a badass. And they don't even want to try him. So he's won every fight by default because he's so intimidating. And as a matter of fact, in wrestling, if you want to talk about worked fighting, in wrestling, the only wrestling match that Vince ever had, in the only match he ever had, he won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, and people still remember that glorious moment today. Whereas, as me, people remember I've had hundreds of wrestling matches. I've had my cheek busted open down to the bone, took 15 stitches. I blew the other knee, my left knee, not the one on the scaffold. I've had a couple of hernia surgeries. I've had my knee scoped more than once. I've had physical therapy on my hip. I've had hundreds of matches, but the only couple that I ever won were by complete and utter flukes, just totally by accident, because somebody else cheated and interfered, and I capitalized on it. And I'll tell you what, when the rematches came about, those sellout crowds in those arenas, they saw me get my ass whipped royally, because I couldn't whip nothing. But see, nobody ever bought a ticket to see Vince Russo wrestle because they knew there was no chance that a New York badass like him was ever going to get beat, so why bother watching it? And so as far as fight, I don't want to fight Vince Russo because, after all, he's a former world champion. But as far as personally, I said some strong things personally that I regret, because it probably offended a group of friends of Vince Russo. They say that the measure of a man is how many friends he's got. And well, everybody knows I've got a lot of friends. They're probably fair weather friends, but they've been on this show. I've been on their shows. We do videos with each other because they're not really, I guess, what you call threatened by me. I'm not anybody that would take their job because I'm not qualified or capable of doing that. And so that's why they like me. But Vince Russo, going back to the person who got Vince Russo in wrestling, John Arezzi, has been on this show, told a story right up until today. Very few people will say or admit that they're Vince Russo's friend, because his greatness makes them jealous. They even make up stories just out of whole cloth about how he screwed him over or stabbed him in the back, all because they're so jealous of his great success. And they're terrible people. They're terrible people, all of them. To say those things, every single person that Vince Russo has ever really worked with on a close basis practically says these things, and they're just all terrible people. But you want to talk about success in the wrestling business, that's what makes them all jealous. Well, but boy howdy, as JR would say. Vince had that big run booking the WWF for 2 years, about 20 years ago, and nobody's been able to follow that since. As a matter of fact, a lot of people have said after Vince Russo's run booking the WWF, it's a miracle that they ever sold one more ticket after that. as a matter of fact, Vince McMahon recognizes that, because Vince McMahon wants Vince Russo back there in the WWF so bad that he paid me a large sum of money to come back to that company after 12 years of saying horrible things about him. And he put me on his TV, on his big network worldwide, and put me together with Eric Bischoff, another guy who has said some horrible things about Vince McMahon, but he put Eric on the show too, worldwide, just to talk about what a pleasure Vince Russo was to work with. Because that's why he was trying to entice Russo to come on back and do some more of whatever it was that he did. Vince set more records in wrestling. I don't think he was with WCW for more than a year before they set a record. They lost more money in 1 year that Vince Russo was with them than every wrestling promotion that has ever been in existence in the 20th century, all combined, put together. More money. Think about how much money that is. That is an amazing amount of money. And Vince Russo did something else that nobody's ever done. When a TV network, Spike TV, actually canceled the show that he was the secret writer of when they found out about it, because he was making all of their other programs on their network look bad in comparison. So they had to get rid of that because they couldn't have all those other writers that they had look pale in comparison. So I tell you, and me, I've loved the wrestling business all my life. Been a fan, been involved in it. But as far as the wrestling business goes, I have to admit that I've got to settle for a distant second place to Vince Russo, because all I have to show for 35 years in the wrestling business, besides a shitload of money and the opportunity to do what I want when I want, is working for every major North American promotion in the last 35 years, being talked about as one of, if not the best managers of all time. Of course, that's Bobby Heenan, but I'll take number two. Being on the creative teams and booking committees for WWF, WCW, and Ring of Honor, being a promoter of and booking, writing the TV for my own two companies, Smoky Mountain Wrestling and Ohio Valley Wrestling, for a total of over 10 years, hundreds, thousands of shows, actually, when you count them all up, announcing on every major network that's carried pro wrestling since the 1980s, helping find and train some of the biggest stars in the business over the last 20 years, putting myself in the position now of working for myself and running my own business, not really being able to go to work for any wrestling promotions these days because I just can't afford to take the cut and pay that would come with that. That's all I've got to settle for, while Vince is up there on the mountaintop. And it's lonely at the top, folks. It's lonely up there at the top. While I've got to sit here and console myself with the statements of people that have said that they're my friends, or that I'm a great performer or manager, or that I'm a brilliant booking mind, or that I gave them their start in the business or their first big break in the business. Guys like, I don't know, John Cena, Randy Orton, Mick Foley, Jim Ross, Ric Flair, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Kane. But who'd those guys ever beat? Vince Russo has the support and the admiration and the eternal gratitude of guys like Ed Ferrara and the Disco Inferno and I know there's another one. Anyway, I've got to admit the defeat, Vince. You're clearly the better man. And I just want you to know, Vince, from the bottom of my heart, and this statement couldn't be anything but truth, to thank you for showing me the error of my ways and putting me in my place. Got something for you. I'm not gonna tell you what it is right here, right now. You're gonna have to wait to find out. You don't tell presents ahead of time. And I don't know when I'm gonna get a chance to give it to you, since I don't know where you live yet. But I assure you, Vince Russo, this is not an empty promise. I got something for you, and I'm gonna give it to you. And like all the best presents, this is probably going to be a surprise. You might even say that you're never going to see this coming. It's going to be a shock. Somewhere, sometime, I'm going to give it to you. You deserve this, and you're going to get exactly what you deserve. Because they say it's better to give than to receive, Vince. And in this case, that couldn't be more true. So I can't wait. I promise you. I cannot wait to give it to you. And I can't wait to see the look on your face when you get it.